Good afternoon and good evening to everybody. My name is Dennis Small, and I'm the editor for the Ibero-American Affairs for the Executive Intelligence Review magazine of Lyndon LaRouche. I would like to welcome to this international webcast how to stop the financial collapse in a weekend. Who wants to destroy Argentina and why? We are gathered with a public, international public, with a participation of our guest, Helga Zepp-LaRouche, President of the Schiller Institute in Germany, and founder of the German party BUSO, of the civil rights, and we are in a meeting with Argentina, and I am speaking from Washington, D.C. We are gathered in a moment where we have a decisive battle in Washington, D.C., in the United States in particular, before the collapse of the financial system. We are in process of the bankruptcy, and the question before us, the United States and Europe and South America, is what can we do in order to stop this financial crash, and what is the economic solution, and give productive jobs to the, and once and for all, we have to get rid of the British Empire that are destroying the totality of the world. In the U.S., there is a battle to implement the fundamental solution, which is to return to the Glass-Steagall, which was established by Franklin Roosevelt in 1933, that not only separates absolutely the speculative bank in one side and the commercial bank productive, but this first bank, the speculative, is the end of the system of the IMF, the end of the Troika. This is a battle where the fundamental aspect in Europe and Ibero-America, they have a fundamental work to do, and in part, that's the objective of this webcast. About a year ago, Mrs. Zepp-LaRouche led the production of a program to the development of the region of the Mediterranean, which was titled, Yes, There is Life After the Euro. One of the chapters in that special report was, what can Europe learn from Argentina? And in certain sense, is one of the fundamental themes that we will address. But the question is not only what Europe can do, the related question is what Argentina in this moment, the government of the President Cristina Kirchner, is in the target of the financial empire that not only want to destroy the government, but to destroy the sovereignty not only of Argentina, but the whole world. And it's going to require where the enemy is weekend.
Ahora, el formato de nuestra videoconferencia de hoy,
This
de
webcast,
antemano le pido a todo mundo disculpas por
and I
haber
can,
empezado un poco tarde. Hay cuestiones técnicas bastante
we have
complejas
technical
en esta
problems, and that's why we are starting a little bit
precisamente
late,
porque es un
precisely because it's a dialogue
diálogo que tiene
that
conectado a un auditorio
that
público
we
en
have a
Buenos Aires,
public
a
in
la señora
Buenos Aires
Zepp-LaRouche
and
de
Mrs.
Alemania.
Helga Zepp-LaRouche
Yo les
in
hablo de
Germany,
Estados Unidos.
and I'm speaking from the United States.
A la vez se está transmitiendo simultáneamente
And it's
esta
being
videoconferencia
transmitted
internacional en 4
internationally
idiomas:
in 4 languages:
en español,
Spanish,
inglés,
English,
en alemán y en francés.
German, and French.
Y hay reuniones, algunas
And there are
mayores,
meetings,
otras pequeñas,
some
pero
big
reuniones
and
que
other
están
small, and
participando en
meetings
esta videoconferencia en
where
Europa,
there is
en
participation
Grecia,
to this
España,
conference in
Italia,
Europe, Greece,
Portugal,
Spain,
Irlanda,
Portugal,
Francia y otros.
Ireland, France,
Y en Iberoamérica,
and other
en
places.
Chile,
In Iberoamerica, Chile, Brazil, Mexico, Peru,
Colombia, República
Colombia,
Dominicana,
Dominican
Argentina.
Republic, and Argentina.
Les damos la bienvenida.
And we give you
Estaremos
greetings and welcome,
solamente aceptando preguntas
and we will be receiving questions
en Argentina, sino
from the
también
Argentinian
los que ya
public,
han enviado preguntas,
but also we have gotten already questions.
que ya han llegado bastantes,
We have received
pero también los que
some
quieran
of
hacer
them,
preguntas en este momento
but
pueden hacer a través
anybody who wants
de
to
la
ask
dirección
questions,
electrónica, correo electrónico,
they can send us questions to
@larouche.com.
preguntas@larouchepub.com.
Vamos a tener 2 presentaciones.
We
hoy.
will
La
have
primera
2
va a ser
presentations
la
today. The
señora
first
LaRouche,
will be the one from
la
Mrs.
segunda
Helga
la leo yo,
LaRouche,
y después de eso tendremos
and
un
after
periodo
that we will, and then Dennis Small, and then a question and answers period. But before we give the microphone to Mrs. LaRouche,
nuestra reunión en Buenos
we have a meeting in Buenos Aires,
y pedirle a
and we want
que está en Buenos Aires que nos dé un mensaje.
our members in Buenos Aires to give a message.
Buenos Aires.
First of all, we have a public here in Buenos Aires. Mr. Dennis Small mentioned that we are together. We want to give thanks to Mrs. Helga LaRouche because she has been a fighter against the oligarchy for many years. And I would like to mention that we are one of the few movements, international movements, against the British Empire. This is something our friends know in Argentina. We have to keep that in mind. And I would like to underline that Mr. LaRouche's ideas, during the Malvinas War, he made a declaration where he says, this is the policy.
That's the lesson we have learned from Argentina. That's why we have this webcast. I assure everyone that this is a tremendous interest, not only for Argentinians, but for the citizens of different nations. And I also would like to say, on the other hand, that when you raise the questions, you should specify if you're making the question to Mr. Dennis or to Mrs. Helga LaRouche. I also, to my right hand, please, those who want to ask questions, stand up, make a line on the right, my right, so that they can come directly to the microphone. I will also want us to be able to speak clearly so that our interpreters can understand what is being said. Welcome to all of you, and thank you very much.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias.
Well, thank you very much.
A ustedes en Buenos Aires.
Thank you, those of you in Buenos Aires who are participating in this international conference of the LaRouche movement.
Helga Zepp-LaRouche.
I want to introduce them Mrs. Helga Zepp-LaRouche, who is going to be speaking to us from Germany. Welcome, Helga. We would like to listen to your ideas today.
Well, I'm very happy to address you all, and this is a rather unusual format for a webcast, bridging the Americas and Europe, but I think the special issue which we are addressing today actually warrants such an approach, because we are right now confronted with an unbelievable danger to human civilization. We are very immediately threatened by what could become a global fascist regime. We are also in the middle of a financial breakdown, and quite related to that, we are also on the verge of a third world war, which easily could and would become a thermonuclear war, and therefore leading to the extinction of civilization. Now, the reason why I'm saying that, and given the fact that I'm speaking from Germany, I have the example of what happened in the 30s in Europe. And even so the situation today is much more dramatic, there are nevertheless parallels from which we can actually learn lessons from. Because as the world very bitterly had to experience, we in Europe reacted to the Great Depression of the 30s with fascism. We had Hitler, we had Mussolini, Franco, and the Petition regime in France. And out of these fascist economic solutions and fascist regimes came World War II. Now, fortunately, in the United States, Franklin D. Roosevelt chose a completely different approach, and that was actually to take on the banking system of Wall Street, to implement Glass-Steagall separation of the banks, go for a Pecora commission to put the criminals into jail, and then with the New Deal and the infrastructure program led successfully the United States out of the Depression. Now, these two examples are also today the two possible roads how we can go as a human civilization. Today, very literally, you have Wall Street and the City of London and the EU Commission openly going for fascist solutions. And they are quite open about it, as I will shortly illustrate. Now, the good thing is that the fight for a return to Glass-Steagall is making tremendous progress in the United States. Just in the last 2 weeks, we had an unprecedented mobilization in the United States, in the Congress, in the Senate, in a nationwide mobilization, where now you have a bill in the Congress which has been so far co-sponsored by 71 congressmen. We have 2 different bills in the Senate also for Glass-Steagall, and we have many, many national and regional organizations who have come out demanding the immediate imposition of Glass-Steagall. Now, today we have the 27th of July. The Congress will go into recess on the 2nd of August, and we are trying nothing less than to try to get the Congress to adopt Glass-Steagall before the recess, or stay in Washington, because the crisis is so immediate that a postponement of this decision could prove to be too late and fatal. Now, the situation is very urgent. The system is hopelessly bankrupt. There are presently $1.4 quadrillion outstanding derivative contracts, and if these would come due, basically nothing in the world can save this system. Now, if one of the too big to fail banks would collapse, it is not going to be one bank, but it would be immediately the danger of what has been called a supernova, namely the complete evaporation of the entire financial system. Now, this is completely known to the financial oligarchy, and they are determined after 5 years of bailout policy, which already was a gigantic transfer of wealth from the poor to the rich, in a period in which the gambling debt of the speculators has been transformed into public state debt. Now that option is still on the table. They're still printing money, but it has been exhausted, and therefore they are now trying to do an additional thing apart from hyperinflationary money printing, so-called quantitative easing. They have come up with a new tool, so-called, which is called the bail-in tool. Now, the first time the world has seen what this bail-in tool is was the so-called Cyprus model, the Cyprus template, in which they just expropriated one fine day all the investors and depositors of the Cyprus banks and basically made a haircut, cutting down the deposits by 60%. And, this has, as a consequence, an immediate reduction of the life expectancy, which I will show you the figure momentarily. Now, the Cyprus template was only the first step. This is supposed to be done everywhere. Now, the second such model was executed just now in Detroit, where the same template was applied, where, according to a so-called creditor hierarchy, the large banks and speculators and traders would get 80% of their money, while the pensioners and other public employees would only get pennies on the dollar. Now, this was just ruled by Kevin Orr, the emergency manager of Detroit. Now, the bail-in basically is an expropriation of the depositors. Now, this tool has been worked out by the Financial Stability Board, which is a sort of a subsection of the Bank of International Settlement, in collaboration with the ISDA, the International Association Swap and Derivative Association, which consists out of the 20 or so too big to fail banks, or the GSIFIs, the globally systemic important financial institutions, who have worked together with the EU Commission on a legislation which is being debated right now in the European Parliament and which already exists in Great Britain and in Switzerland as a law, and in the United States. Now, according to this creditor hierarchy, derivatives are exempt, while the real assets of the people, the living standard, the pensions, the wages, all of this is being cut to a tiny percentage. And it is very clear, if you apply the Cyprus template, or now the Detroit template, to the entire Eurozone, which is what is the idea, and to the entire United States, you are immediately killing millions of people. They are now openly calling for fascist solutions. JP Morgan, which is one of the too big to fail banks, recently published a 16-page paper called Adjustment in the Eurozone Halfways There, in which they basically say that they only succeeded halfways to establish a banking dictatorship, and that what has to be removed now is the obstacle to implement a full dictatorship, namely the constitutions, especially of Southern Europe, which were given as an answer to fascism, and therefore they have still principles in them which make it impossible to impose the measures which they want to impose. Now, these constitutions, for example, have basic human rights provisions, and they have protectionist principles which protect wages, pensions, and dignity of human beings and so forth. Now that call by J.P. Morgan was then seconded by a paper from the Boston Consulting Group, which is the world's second largest management consultancy, and they openly said that the kind of austerity which they want to implement in Europe, but also in the dollar zone, are requiring solutions like in the 30s, an environment like in the 30s, meaning very clearly fascist governments. And then they say that the average haircut which they propose for the Eurozone would be above board 34% of all assets, but some countries would have to take more, like Greece 47%, Spain 56%, Portugal 57%. Now, that is presently the official policy of the G20, because at the recent G20 meeting in Moscow in July, they put out a statement endorsing the Financial Stability Board guidelines for a bail-in policy. Now, the IMF, for their part, in their new assessment of the Eurozone crisis, said this is all not enough. We need to have an immediate banking union, a central European cross-border resolution authority. Now, what that means is that basically all the depositors of every country, every savings banks, every person who has deposits in these banks would be called upon if you have, for example, the gambling debt of one of the large hedge funds or investment banks causing the default of such a bank. And because Dodd-Frank has that already in it, you would not have only European-wide cross-border resolution authorities, but international ones. So every person in the Eurozone and in America would basically be expropriated if these banks would collapse. Now, the president of the Bavarian Cooperative Union, Mr. Stefan Götzl, called this law an enabling law, like what the Nazis did in the 30s. And Mr. Götzl said, we in Germany have unfortunately bad experiences with enabling laws, and therefore he is rejecting it. The reason is that the German savings banks do not want to be held accountable if large gambling banks collapse. Now, if this is implemented, and that is planned for this fall, given the size of the outstanding debt, and given the other problems of the world economy, namely the existing food shortage, which is caused by a combination of the EU agriculture policy, the agriculture policy of the Obama administration, the misuse of fuel for biofuel, the non-compensation for droughts and floods, which have destroyed large agricultural production areas, the failure of the energy policy in Germany, which already makes the real economy basically in a terrible crisis. So therefore, this bail-in would mean the instant death of millions of people, and it would lead to chaos. And obviously the idea is to implement fascist dictatorships simultaneously in the entire transatlantic region. Now, I know from absolutely reliable sources that in the circles of the EU Commission there is an open discussion among themselves that they want to reduce the life expectancy of the population to 66 years. Because they say that with all these demographic changes, people are getting older, we cannot afford to pay the pensions anymore. Now, how do they want to reduce the life expectancy to 66 years? Well, it's the known proven method of the financial oligarchy with the four horsemen of the apocalypse: hunger, pestilence, war, and death. And that is being used. So if you see these political measures, it's not innocence and incompetence. They want deliberately to cull the human population, and they want to implement the policy of the British Empire, which has said openly, repeatedly, the aim is to reduce the world population from presently 7 billion to 1 billion human beings. Now, there is a direct correlation between the economic policies and the destruction of productive capacities and, the life expectancy. For example, the Robert Koch Institute in Germany just put out a study that the rich in Germany, which is a relatively wealthy country still, live 11 years longer than the poor. The German Doctor Association just put out a statement in May that there is a direct correlation. The lower the income, the lower the life expectancy will become. They call it a shame, saying that in a rich country like Germany this should not be the case. But the number of poor, even in Germany, has massively increased in the last 10 years. In other countries, it's even more dramatic. For example, in Glasgow, in Scotland, in a poor district, in the district of Kelton of Glasgow, man age is average 54 years. In the rich district of the same city, in Lancy, it is 82 years. Now, in the fourth poverty report of the German government, which recently came out, they say that the wealthiest 10% of the population own more than 53% of all assets, while the lower half only possesses less than 1% of all assets. Well, in Greece, the picture obviously looks even more dramatic. The UN Human Rights Inspector Lumina accused the Troika, that is the IMF, the EZB and the EU Commission, of having massively committed violations of human rights through austerity, liberalization, privatization, reduction of wages, layoffs, excessively rigid measures. The unemployment in Greece has massively gone up to about 27%, 64.2% youth unemployment. Homelessness has gone up by 25%. There is a poll now which shows that people in Greece have lost all hope. They are only governed by rage and despair. People were asked, what is your perception of the economy? 98% said bad. What is your trust in the government? 90% said none. The population was reduced already by 1 of 10 million, so 10% through immigration and early deaths. The birth rate has gone down 10%. Stillbirth in a European country has increased 20%. There is a complete collapse of the healthcare system. The supplies for life-saving medications for cancer, antibiotics, and other things like anesthetics has gone down by 90%. 15% are without any health care. There are lacking 6,500 doctors and 20,000 medical staff. And basically, children who are now in the category of severe material deprivation have gone up to 320,000. Now that is a quite sizable city of children living in complete poverty. The suicides in Greece have increased 26% in 1 year from 2010 to 2011. Now let's look at the crisis template. Let's first look at the figure Greece total unemployment. let's just go through the slides. Slide number 8, 9, and 8 and 9. Yes, this is the unemployment. Next slide. Well, let's go to the next slide. Okay, here you have the success story of the IMF. These are the figures I just had mentioned. Now let's go to the Cyprus template. Next slide. Now the bail-in robbed the depositors of 70% of the domestic deposits. A study just showed, can you go to the next slide, that the economy as a result of this is shrinking, next slide please, is shrinking by 60%. Now that is not a figure, but it means that, you know, all the little stores, the family stores, the what people are living off has just been completely eliminated. With the present policy, Cyprus has no chance of recovery. Now the unemployment will go up expectedly to 40%, and by 2015. Now let's go to the next slides and then to Italy. Now Italy, which is after all the third largest country of the EU, is also targeted for complete murder. Now one of the co-authors of the Club of Rome, which is one of the evil oligarchical institutions responsible for the lie of the limits to growth, which is one of the founding organizations of the worldwide ecologist movement, one of their co-founders, Jürgen Renders, just correctly said that the EU Commission represents an elitocracy, meaning an aristocracy of the elite of an aristocracy, which has been able to impose measures on these countries which would have never been able to be implemented by nationally elected governments, which is absolutely true. Then he praises the Monti government for having measures, implemented measures in Italy, which has caused the lowest birth rate in the world, and that in a Catholic country, namely only 1.3 children per woman, and has created conditions where women have to choose to either work, next slide, to either work or give birth, but they cannot do both at the same time. Now in 2012, as a result of this, there was a negative demographic record. Less babies, 12,000 babies less than 2011, and more death rate, namely 19,000 more people died. So the total reduction in the population was 78,697, which is the size of a smaller, medium-sized city. Now the youth unemployment had a 45% increase. The unemployment is now at 12.20%, and the health expenditures has been reduced by 1.9%. Patients allowed into hospitals, 500,000 less. Available hospital beds, 15% less. And according to the situation there, the suicide rate has gone up massively there as well. Now, can you take away the slide? Now, if you think this is only the case in the poor southern European countries, I can assure you that the same condition exists also for the United States. The U.S. Journal of U.S. Medical Association just put out a report saying that the life expectancy in the United States is 78 years of age. But in many areas, the division between poor and rich is equally dramatic. For example, in the McDowell County in West Virginia, a man average life expectancy is 63.9 years. In Fairfax, Virginia, it's 81.7. Now, the United States, in the list of OECD countries, has now only placed 27 of life expectancy. And you can see with Detroit the same tendency like in Greece, Cyprus and Spain. Now, one should really say this is not a natural catastrophe and it is completely unnecessary. In Detroit, where in 2005, Linda LaRouche intervened when the auto crisis reached really a complete point by proposing the retooling of the machine tool sector to retool the machine tool design and machine tool areas of the auto industry to build other things like large agricultural vehicles, maglev trains, high-speed trains, sluices for waterways, and this would have been a complete saving of the very important capacity of the auto industry, which now is totally collapsed and has been shut down. Now, what happened instead was that they went to fix the shortfalls by basically in the pension funds with a complex of financial deals. So they took out 1.4 billion to purchase a series of derivatives for hundreds of millions of dollars. They established 2 service corporations, established trusts, which then sold the so-called pension obligation certificates of participation to investors. Now the city, in order to cover themselves, bought also credit insurances which were supposed to reimburse the investors if these trusts would default. Now the banks which were involved in this was Merrill Lynch, UBS, Dexia, Commerzbank and others. Now the interest rate of these hedges quickly became a problem. And when in 2009 the credit rating of Detroit was downgraded, this triggered a clause forcing Detroit to buy itself out of the deal, and that cost several hundreds of millions of dollars. And then the city signed a deal that backed future payments with tax revenues from the city's casinos. And that had the nice side effect to turn these banks from unsecured creditors into secured creditors. Now this is why now, where insolvency of Detroit was declared, these banks harvest 80% of available assets, while the pensioners and others get nothing or pennies. Now the cost of these credit default swaps was also largely increased through the criminal LIBOR manipulation, where the 20 or so largest bank in the world manipulated the LIBOR interest rate over decades, causing 75% of all communes in the United States 3-digit billions of losses. They also caused massive losses to American hospitals, to nursing homes, to communes in Europe, and they have literally killed already many people through these effects. Now obviously this is a total violation of the Constitution in Michigan, and we have basically declared the fight for Detroit to be the turning point for this banking fascism in the United States, and we will do everything in our power to not let this go through. Now, we also worked out a plan for the economic development of Southern Europe, which could be implemented immediately if the political will could be mobilized. This is a kind of a Marshall Plan for Southern Europe and the Mediterranean, which would immediately eliminate poverty. It would start to create productive workplaces. It would give a hope and a vision for the population there. This is ready-made. It could be started tomorrow. But the problem is that the Wall Street and the European banking sector have developed into a large criminal monster, sucking the blood out of the population. They also have established a very perfidious revolving door, whereby banks own parliamentarians, deploy their employees to become parliamentarians or work as aides in the Congress or in the Bundestag or in other parliaments, and then pay them large sums for their deals. Now, the problem is that the only way how we can get rid of this crisis and how we can stop this is through the immediate implementation of Glass-Steagall. We have to bankrupt Wall Street, we have to bankrupt the City of London and those investment banks which are behind this fascist scheme. If Glass-Steagall would be implemented by the US Congress right now, you would protect the commercial banks and everything which has to do with the real economy, and you would force the too big to fail banks to clean up their books by themselves without having access to the deposits of the depositors, without bailout packages from the taxpayer, and given the nature of the system, they would all have to declare bankruptcy, and we don't need them. We do not need derivatives, we don't need investment banks, but we need a national credit generation coming from the sovereign government, and then we can create as much credit as is needed to get the real economy going as necessary. This is exactly what Roosevelt did in 1933. And right now there is almost a revolutionary process going on in the United States, and we have introduced similar bills. For example, there are 5 such bills in Italy. There is a huge discussion about Glass-Steagall in many countries in Europe. And if the United States would go for Glass-Steagall, it could lead to an immediate dramatic change of the world situation. Now, there is another aspect of why we need Glass-Steagall without delay. We are on the edge of World War III. Through the revelations of Edward Snowden, the biggest scandal in the history of the world has come out. The NSA is spying practically on everybody in the United States, in Europe, in Latin America, and many other countries. They have established a global surveillance of all communications, from emails, faxes, phone conversations, and everything else. And it is such an unbelievable violation of human rights and privacy that the Brazilian president was quite correct to call for a UN General Assembly meeting to discuss this. Now, more from the funny side, there is a German economist with the name of Hellmeyer who has said that, in an alliance there should be the principle of equality. So why do not the US banks and other institutions give all their emails and phone data to the European banks, to the European firms, to the European governments and other institutions, so that everybody in Europe and Latin America can look into the private communication of lawyers, judges, congressmen in the United States. That way we would have all equal conditions. Now that is a proposal for consideration as well. But more on the serious side, what is causing the United States and Great Britain with their Tempora program, which is, according to Snowden, even worse than the NSA spying, what causes them to be so absolutely obsessed to spy on the whole world in this way? But unfortunately, it has everything to do with this, what is called globalization, or the idea that they really try to submit the whole world to a global empire. Now, that idea to risk thermonuclear war and potentially even go for preemptive nuclear war against Russia and China has the same reason, global empire. Now, the official journal of the US Air Force a couple of months ago had an absolutely outrageous article in which they wrote that due to technological developments in the nuclear weapon technology, in the delivery systems, in the targeting and acquisitions, the previous NATO doctrine MAD is no longer valid, that the implementation and use of nuclear weapons no longer leads to the necessary destruction of everybody, but that you can now take out the nuclear arsenal of an opponent without nuclear fallout. And therefore, the United States could survive a preemptive nuclear strike against Russia and China. Now, that journal article was not a sole approbation, is demonstrated by a new article in the Yale International Journal written by Professor Amartya Etzioni, which I also would advise our listeners and viewers to read themselves, in which Professor Etzioni is ringing the alarm bell, so to speak, saying that there is right now plans by the Obama administration to launch preemptive nuclear strike against China. That the air-sea battle doctrine, is basically proning the United States to do exactly that. And he says there must be an urgent debate among elected officials that this is the plan of the United States. And I agree. There must be an urgent debate internationally, because according to the Nuremberg Tribunal, according to the UN Charter and every international law, not only is the preparation of an aggressive war a crime against humanity, but all the more the preparation of a nuclear war. And I think we need to have an immediate international discussion and revolt against such a doctrine. Also, the former member of the Reagan administration Commerce Department, Paul Craig Roberts, just put out a very alarming video in which he said the same thing, that the US is preparing for nuclear war. So we need to have Glass-Steagall, because only if we implement Glass-Steagall can we derail such insane plans, because we need to change the entire paradigm. We are right now, as a human civilization, at the abyss of extermination, and we need to change the paradigm completely, away from oligarchism, greed, monetarism, the idea that man can only know about reality through sense perception, because man supposedly is only a higher form of animal, or even, as the greenies are saying, a parasite in nature, and the fewer human beings the better for nature, or that the only identity of man is to find pleasure in the here and now. But we have to shift to the true identity of mankind. Mankind is the only creative species. We are the only ones who can make willful changes in our mode of existence, and the fact that we have increased our population capacity from a couple of million to presently 7 billion, and can easily extend that to several two-digit billions of people, is only possible because man in his cognitive identity can again and again, through technological and scientific progress, change the mode of its own existence. We need to have completely new ideas and a vision about what should the future of human civilization be. We must have human beings not competing with swine and pigs, but, like certain bankers are doing, who are trying to get to the trough the first. But we have to have human beings who have their identity as creative human beings, who are capable to all the time invent new physical principles, to compose beautiful classical music, to write beautiful classical dramas and poetry. Now, this is the conception of man which man needs if we as a species are supposed to not only come out of this crisis, but to guarantee our existence over the next several million of years as mankind in space. Because mankind is not sitting on a planet which is in a vacuum, but we will have to confront dangers like asteroids. We will have to deal with problems which are taking place with the sun in a very long time from now, but we have to just simply change our entire way of thinking and develop a human species which is worthy of the dignity of man. Now, I think we are capable of doing that. I'm absolutely optimistic that the human species is the most beautiful creation in this universe and that we can get out of this crisis. But it will only be possible if we change the paradigm, if we implement Glass-Steagall, if we establish a sovereign alliance of perfectly sovereign republics in the tradition of John Quincy Adams. And then we have the most beautiful future ahead of us.
Thank you very much. I want to ask, we have several technical difficulties because of the different languages, and we want to resolve that. We will continue with the other presentation, and then we'll have questions and answers. It's about who wants to destroy Kirchner. To answer to that question, we have to do it the opposite way. We have to respond why, to the question why. It's not a question of method. If we don't solve that problem, we will not win. We have to see the situation in Argentina. What happens in Argentina is not because of internal forces. It's not because it's in front of people in Argentina. It's because of all this international. The British, like a big imperialist, and they are able to manipulate people against each other in order to control both. And if they are capable, they can manipulate. And moreover, because of that manipulation, they are able to manipulate people. They don't see the people like a human being, but they are bestialized and reduce them to less. We have this situation like in the case of Syria, in the war in the Middle East, where the British are manipulating these situations in order to manipulate and people who are in the middle, they are like slaves. This particular idea of the bestial concept has been in extreme, like in the Middle East, where the explicit cannibalism explicit in a video that they posted in YouTube. This is the maximum manipulation, imperial manipulation, to bestialize, and it has a lot to do with what we have to address, a political question, as we have to do now. In the attempts to destroy the governments, also is fundamental that this, what is the positive concept? In order to do that, in order to answer to that, we have to use an old friend who was the founder of the modern science, who was the main architect of the Golden Renaissance, who also initiated the process of the discovery of the Americas, in this side of the Atlantic. A great philosopher and scientist, Cardinal Nicholas of Cusa. In particular, Cusa, he did a writing, the Pace Fidei, because he was addressing something like what is going on right now in Constance, where there were massacres in Constantinople, and they were like the bloodshed. At the beginning of the dialogue in the Pace Fidei, he starts saying, news of the atrocities which have recently been perpetrated by the Turkish king in Constantinople and have now been divulged have also inflamed a man who once saw that region with the zeal of God. That amongst many sights he asked the Creator of all things if in his kindness he might moderate the persecution which raged more than usual on account of diverse religious rites, to find a unique and propitious concordance, and through this to constitute a perpetual peace in religion upon the appropriate in true course. And this is to seek the truth, not with the sensorial perception, but using the to use, so we can see from the process, dynamic process. With this Cusa's writing, there are different religious processes, there are different rites,
It's not like Aristotle with his nose rounding down in the sense certainty, but he's using reason to determine what's the composition of the universe. Cusa tells us in Napoleon says, and he puts it in terms of everything that is created has a cause and is a reason. Regarding the why is this and it's not that. Therefore, the idea that causality and reason exist in the universe, and one is capable of using that singular capacity that man has, or unique capacity that man has, as Cusa puts it in the voice of Pablos. This is only understandable to the mind, that the substance and the essence, and not what it is. Put it in other words, to respond to the international crisis that we're facing right now in an adequate way we have in Argentina, we need to have a fundamental change. Aristotle with our noses in perception has to be withdrawn. That through the work that Columbus carried through resulted in the discovery of the Americas. Having said this, as a conceptual framework to deal with the Argentine situation, we must ask ourselves, why Argentina? I'm getting mixed in both sides, here, no matter what. As Helga just told us, in detail, we are facing a crisis. There are people. We're talking about $1.6 trillion, which we can see in the first slide. This gives us an idea of the disproportionate size of and weight of the financial aggregates in which that will disappear once we bring that are coming into being since Glass-Steagall was abolished in the United States. It is precisely the financial derivatives as opposed to the
It's not a speculative debt and they want to impose a renegotiation of the debt with a cut of 60% in Argentina. Not only the British didn't like that Argentina didn't accept that, but also they didn't like
que a mi parecer dicen toda la historia de por qué el Imperio Británico quiere tumbar el gobierno del Sistema.
I have two graphs which I think illustrate why the British Empire wants to destroy the Argentine government. The rate between debt and gross internal product, gross national product. And as you can see here, the countries in the southern Europe, because of the policies of the IMF, specifically, the policies of the fund, which are supposed to bring down the rate of debt to GDP, the cost of the debt that they imposed on these countries, the result has been the contrary. The ratio to debt to GDP has actually increased. It resulted exactly in the opposite of what they claimed they were going to do. They also increased the debt in a sovereign way. What happened? This is what happened in terms of the ratio in the case of Argentina. According to the British, this was an unacceptable crime. Because if one sees the physical economy in Europe under the policies of the Troika, we can see one of the most important measures in the physical economy. In this case, we're talking about youth unemployment. In the case of youth unemployment, due to the policies of the Troika, the results have been terrible. And you have seen a tripling of the youth unemployment and more in all the countries of Southern Europe, in Spain, in Greece, Portugal, in Italy, I think it was 60%. And any country with that level of unemployment, it has no future, which was obviously the intention of the Troika. What did the government of Argentina do? It brought down youth unemployment. And let us see that in the next chart. In the case of Argentina, in 2013, as the debt was reorganized, the youth, before it was reorganized, youth unemployment was extremely high. It has been brought down since the reorganization. Not enough, but it has been brought down. But what I am telling you is that in Argentina, they have adopted policies that are contrary to what the Troika has been applying all over. That this government and this country has to be eliminated. That is the decision of the Troika. It has nothing to do with the internal policies. It has to do, you can see that in the magazine such as The Economist. This has occurred because of the economic collapse. And that's why the policies of the International Monetary Fund in 2011, when some countries in Europe began to adopt the same policies of Argentina, And afterwards, it continues its offensive of attacking, supposedly, with the statistics of inflation, saying that if Argentina was not doing what the IMF told it to do, it could expel Argentina from the IMF. Me? I'm not an Argentinian, but speaking as an international citizen, I will tell the Argentinian government, given that ultimatum from the IMF, it should respond, thank you very much. Don't take us out. We are going to live on our own. We don't want to be part of the IMF. And not only that, I will tell the European countries, we will organize the other countries so that we can ally with other countries, with forces in other countries such as the United States that are looking for an alternative. Where does the IMF get the idea, the authority to tell Argentina that it doesn't like its statistics? And the same IMF that in 1999 gave instruction to the Colombian government that it had to include drug trafficking in terms of its economic statistics. Where is the moral authority with this genocide that they're generating? There are two different views of the world, of what man is, of what a national sovereign state is within that framework. Having seen all of this, however, the intention of the IMF of the why they are doing what they're doing, we must then begin to break it down. And what we have to do is actually face it from the standpoint of Nicholas of Cusa, where he says everything has a cause and has a reason, what it is and what it isn't. The cause, in the case of Argentina, is not in Argentina. It's outside of Argentina. It's the pyramid, as it's occurred in many, many, many countries. We have the Economist magazine, owned by the Rothschild, which says that the government of Argentina, we have the newspaper, the Financial Times, which is saying exactly the same thing. That is to say, the representative of those interests who follow the policies of London. And I will give you a recent quote from London, from the Economist of London, where, among other things, they also attacked the government of Dilma Rousseff. They don't like her, because the government of Rousseff, what is it doing in terms of reducing interest rates and so forth? And they say that's unacceptable. The problem, they say, that the government stopped reforming the market, and then they say to her, it would have been better not to have the government intervention and let the free market set the policies. And then, and they say very clearly, the mistakes of Mrs. Rousseff are minor compared to those that have been committed by, for example, Cristina Fernandez. At least they say it in Mexico. They don't like that. It's very clear what they're saying. And from that, the top of that pyramid is where they're carrying out this campaign at the international level. That this comes from the vulture funds, that Argentina should pay 100% to those banks who did not participate in the renegotiation of the debt in the secondary market. They are buying this debt at pennies on the dollar, and then they want to demand payment for the full amount. the face value of those instruments. And that's what is happening at the international level. This is like the mega speculator and drug trafficker, George Soros. George Soros himself financed who is financing in great measure by the dirty money, drug money. And I say that because I know that. George Soros has said that dirty money, he invested that in the Obama campaign. Obama, from the first moment he came into the presidency of the United States, he's also proceeding to legalization of drugs that Soros has demanded. Then there are people that have their henchmen among the economics professors at the universities, from the Chicago School, and who also support the legalization of drugs. And they don't want to end speculation. I want to say I'm warning to friends in Argentina that I don't want to mention by name, that they, don't be careful with Stiglitz, because Stiglitz, although he sounds like he's anti these policies, Joseph P. Stiglitz was the one that personally took Soros to the leaders of the Third World who were at the United Nations, so that Soros would convince them that there was no point in knocking over the board, that they should simply accept the instructions of Soros. Of course, the the bills that Soros hands out are laden with cocaine, and that Stiglitz is the one that brought him in. Stiglitz at the University of Columbia created a center for the initiative for dialogue, and one of the main financial supports from this comes from the Open Society Institute, which is owned by George Soros. Inside of Argentina, however, looking at the pyramid from the top down, sometimes they don't know what they're doing. They have participated in this international campaign to bring down the Cristina Kirchner's government. They talk about the right wing, the Rural Society of Argentina, Sonacri, which is very tied into Spaniards such as Aznar, who used to work hand in glove with George Bush. And then they have protests and so forth. But when recently they named there was an operation that came that was revealed at that point, because on the one hand there was a lot of violence against the Pope, violent expressions against the Pope, protests, which accused Pope Francis of being a crypto Jew, and that he accepted the total injustice of the Nuremberg tribunals. And so there was this violent attack against the Pope, which is very curious, that one of the big defenders of the government of Argentina, this came from the synarchists. That we have the case of Horacio Verbitsky, who attacked the Pope violently against Pope Francis, because he had to break all relationship with the Pope. They said Argentina had to break with the Pope completely. The government of Argentina had to break with the Pope, and everybody understood what he meant. The relationship between the Pope and the Argentina government, as any relations between any sovereign states, and sovereign heads of states.
es una figura verdaderamente nefasta en Argentina.
Berbinsky is really a fatal figure in Argentina.
Podría ser el López Rega,
He could be the López Rega,
claro, un López Rega izquierdista,
but López Rega from the left, of course, but still a López Rega.
es un asiduo promotor de la legalización
He has been promoting drug legalization
dentro del gobierno también.
within the Argentinian government.
Y claro,
And of course,
no era de faltar,
you can,
Horacio Verbitsky,
Horacio Verbitsky
de influencia
is an agent of influence of George Soros,
legalizador.
drug legalizer George Soros.
Verbitsky recibe la beca
Verbitsky
Van Hamet,
received
entregada por la organización
the Van Hamet Prize,
Observatorio de Derechos Humanos, que es una organización
which is an organization
dirigida por George Soros.
headed by George Soros.
Y no es que solamente recibió un premio,
It's not just that they gave him a prize,
donde venía ese premio.
but you know where the money came from.
En 1999,
In 1999, Soros,
fue a Verbitsky en el Consejo Consultivo Internacional de Human Rights Watch
Soros put Verbitsky on the Consulting Committee for Human Rights Watch, which is an organization he runs and finances his house.
tiene un enemigo principal,
So if Argentina has a main enemy
el Imperio Británico,
from the that is the British Empire,
internos,
there are no internal enemies in Argentina.
los que están detrás,
The people who are behind these internal people in Argentina,
nunca jamás se va a entender
unless we understand that this is the case, we will never understand what is going on with these people in Argentina,
desde la óptica
because you cannot see this from unless you look at it from the standpoint of Nicolás of Cusa, you will not understand what is going on.
Cierro esta intervención.
I conclude this presentation
Seguro se considerará bastante polémico dentro de Argentina.
with something that will be considered very controversial in Argentina.
Me imagino en casi todos lados del
And I believe that in almost every place else,
mundo intencionalmente.
and I do that on purpose.
Lyndon LaRouche,
Lyndon LaRouche
el movimiento de LaRouche,
and the LaRouche movement,
como nos contaba Lulú,
as Lulu was telling us,
relación de amistad con la
Ha-
nación argentina,
has carried out a relationship of friendship with the Argentinian government, sustained a relationship of friendship with the Argentinian government.
político estadounidense,
And he's the only American politician
Argentina en el caso de la agresión
that supported Argentina in the case of the aggression carried out by the British during the Malvinas War.
Doctrina Monroe,
And he invoked the Monroe Doctrine,
John Quincy Adams,
the doctrine which had been developed by John Quincy Adams,
toleraremos
that we cannot tolerate
de potencias
that foreign powers, imperial foreign powers from outside the hemisphere,
a un país de las Américas
try to recolonize a country in the Americas.
La intención del señor LaRouche
LaRouche's intention
no es
is not to
con la gente, no tenemos la intención de quedar bien.
is not to win favor with people. We have no intention of winning favor with people.
En una guerra
We want to wage a war
librando la humanidad entera.
to free the entirety of humanity
Difíciles que quizás
in a difficult time.
inmediato
Perhaps we're not going to win it immediately,
necesarias
but it's a necessary battle
podamos aliarnos
so that we can ally
dar ya ahora
to finish now with
este imperio británico
this British Empire,
siguiendo los estados nacionales
which is destroying national sovereign states.
y tenemos que ganar esa victoria
And we must win that
internacional
victory,
realizada por el señor LaRouche. En
win this war, international war that is being waged by Mr. LaRouche.
les doy las gracias
I thank you very much
por participación en esta discusión.
for participating in this dialogue.
Lo que yo quería presentarles
What I wanted to present to you,
pasar al
and now
en Buenos Aires
I want to go back to the audience in Buenos Aires
preguntas,
so that we can begin to have questions,
sea para Helga o para mí,
questions either addressed to either Helga or to myself.
las que nos han llegado.
And also we're going to address some of the questions that we have received via internet at this point.
Bueno, acá empezamos con la
Well,
sesión
we will start.
del señor Miguel.
We're starting with a question from Mr. Miguel, Don Miguel. Well, thank you very much for this beautiful presentation. I have one question I want to ask of you, given what you have said. It was very clear. something that you made, you brought out from darkness. Yeah, this thing with this Montonero, who is now currently a very close friend and representing the interests of George Soros. It was Soros, exactly. He controls our ports, for example. Without any doubt, that's the enemy. But as Churchill said, after the Second World War, they started destroying in the 49, in which the payments began. You know, they tried to establish control of all the wealth that is in the underground. What has to do with social well-being? How is it possible that mining in the province of San Juan, and we're borders with Rioja, it was handed to the Spaniards with, let's say, it was a secret deal, where we have Vaca Muerta, and this is one of the biggest deposits in the world regarding gas. How was it possible that you say? Second, they hand over everything. Tell us what is the appreciation you have from the outside about what happened here. I am sure that the IMF was behind that, but we turn over the national wealth. So we gave it to them at a bargain basement price. What is it that you have to comment about this? I suppose that that question also had to do with the question of Argentina, but briefly, the problem, Miguel, is exactly what we were saying before. Yeah, when we have to look at this from the standpoint of Nicolas of Cusa, you cannot fall just at the level of what things seem to be, but you have to look for the causes, for the reason. Certain things occur which seem to be apparently totally contradictory. If you look at it from the standpoint, not from a different standpoint, you see it this way and I see it that way. But we have to see with the methodology that CUSA offers us. That is, what is causing this? What is causing and producing this? Only in that fashion can you have a correct assessment of what's going on. The strategic issue, main strategic issue at this point, is if we are able or not to destroy the international financial empire, reestablishing the Glass-Steagall principles. This is not merely some legislative initiative. It means destroying the financial apparatus that is behind of the different operations we are seeing. Thus, our attention, especially our emotional and psychological attention, has to be towards the point of the pyramid. These subjects are all important, but you are dealing with the effects only. So you have to actually deal with the cause. Should we deal with the effects? Yeah, of course. These are policies that are contradictory in Argentina, and the policies that have been applied by the government of President Kirchner, and under the agencies of Stiglitz and others, which which I think are very inappropriate policies. But if we look at this from this universal perspective that I'm proposing, then you can see how this thing comes into being. So I think it goes really to the point. What you're saying is exactly true. Look at the different reactions when Pope Francis was elected. Not only when he first elected, but the last statements where he proclaimed himself against the legalization of drugs. And that's very controversial. I was very affected by that fact that Aníbal Fernández supported the Pope's statement, which I doubt very seriously Verbitsky will do. If from this perspective, from this standpoint, we're analyzing the policies, we could talk, and I'm sure we could do it, of the entire Argentine situation. So we could give you my answer in this regard so we can go on to the comments from Helga. Good afternoon. And I would like to ask Helga, what's her opinion regarding this Nobel Prize winner in economics? And I would like to my question then, what's your opinion of this economist? And a criticism regarding what was his selection for the Nobel Prize.
Oh, well, I don't have a very high opinion of him because there is right now only one crucial battle, and that is how we can return to the question of physical economy, and that can only be done if you go for Glass-Steagall as the absolute first step. Sometimes he makes, statements which are looking a little bit smarter than most economists, but in toto, I must say that the entire class of economists has proven to be so absolutely incompetent to make a correct prognosis for this crisis or come up with correct solutions, that I really think that the question of what is economic science has to be retaught completely. And I hope you forgive me to say that there is one economist who is completely different, and that is Lyndon LaRouche. And I'm not saying that because I'm married to him, but because he has an absolute proven record of having been absolutely correct in predicting the crisis and coming up with solutions. And on that front, I must say that Mr. Krugman has not come out with any initiative how to get out of this crisis. And, if you are neither able to predict the crisis in time correctly, nor if you, when you are in the final phase of it, come out with a global, credible way out, maybe you should change the profession. And Nobel Prizes are not impressive either, given the fact that such people like Henry Kissinger, Obama, and various other people have received Nobel Prizes. So maybe this Nobel Prize is not so noble at all.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias.
Thank you very much. Once Lyndon LaRouche said, in order to get a Nobel Prize in economics,
you must develop an economic policy which is totally crazy, psychotic, which is based preferably in mathematics. You have to do forecasting. Forecasts that never come into being. Absolutely. And that's why you win the Nobel Prize. Then, of course, once you win the prize, you have to apply the psychotic theory to the destruction of at least one nation. Once you have fulfilled these requirements, then you can win the Nobel Prize. Let's go to Argentina for the next question before we start dealing with the questions we have received from our international audience. This question comes from myself. I have been here organizing in Argentina. It's a question that I want to address to Mrs. LaRouche. It is very important that we understand our role as citizens of nations. On the other hand, we have to look at the great patriots, the founders of nations of the Americas, Benjamin Franklin, people who founded a republic, nations. There are people who are not trapped in false nationalisms. I see that as a paradox, because sometimes one falls into the trap. In Argentina, I believe they call it, in Mexico we call it caciquism, which is honchoism in English, I guess, which is a wrong conception of patriotism. My question then for Mrs. LaRouche, how do you distinguish between the vision of a citizen of the world, and how do you not fall into this notion of honchoism? How do you not fall into that trap?
Oh, I think the answer was really given in a very beautiful way by Friedrich Schiller, the German poet of freedom, who is the one according to whom the Schiller Institute has been named in the first place, because I thought that the image of man and the ideas which Schiller developed are really the most important ingredient lacking in world politics today. As a matter of fact, together with the ideas of Nicolaus of Kues, I really think that the two individuals who have developed the most important ideas how mankind can get out of this crisis right now are indeed Kues and Schiller. And it's not surprising that both have a very similar answer to the question you posed. Friedrich Schiller basically said that man has to be with the same passion a world citizen and a patriot, but that being a world citizen and a patriot must never be in a contradiction with each other. So therefore, when the cause of mankind, the common aims of mankind are in a certain sense, the further reaching definition of the goals of mankind as a whole for the future, while the most beautiful traditions of your national culture, your national science, your national music, your national great classical art are the sort of roots from which your soul is being nourished. But these two things must be a unity. So I think that Schiller's answer to be a patriot and a world citizen at the same time, and that the one must never be in contradiction with the other, is actually the solution. Now, Nicolaus of Kues answers the same question in a slightly different way by having this idea of concordance in the universe. He says concordance can only be possible if all microcosms develop in the macrocosm to a harmonious one, and that only if every microcosm takes its self-interest to develop the other microcosm in the best possible way, and vice versa, can you have concordance in the macrocosm. Now that means essentially, with other words and with slightly different approach, it's the same idea that if you replace the word microcosm with nation, every nation can only develop if all other nations develop to the fullest. And you can only have peace in the world at large if all nations develop their maximum potential and help each other to do so, so that mankind as a whole can develop all its potentiality. And that therefore the basis of foreign policy must be love. Love meaning like a good father wanting the children to develop, like a good child wants the grandmother to develop. So, love means simply the self-fulfillment of the maximum interest of the other. And if that is the basis of foreign policy, then you never can have honchoism, but you will always say, I want that the other nation is becoming the fullest, most beautiful nation, like Mexico should develop according to its best traditions, like Argentina or Brazil or other nations of Ibero-America. And if all of that is applied to the cause of mankind, I think we reach what I call the condition of adulthood. Because I don't think that the present paradigm of globalization, monetarism, greed, stupid money lust, that is not human. I think that we will reach a point of development where we will leave all of this behind us and become, a nation which conquers the stars, which goes through the extraterrestrial imperative of leaving behind that phase of evolution which causes us to try to solve conflicts by war. But that we can become a human species of scientists, of artists, of composers, of poets. And then, I think that question can be solved to the best answer. And I believe that the new paradigm will only be possible if we go to the high phases of each culture and revive that, and by making that universally known, that we can develop a new culture which may go beyond nationalism eventually, not in terms of language or in terms of history and joint culture, but from the standpoint of doing joint space missions and other great missions where the question of nationality becomes less important because we are united as scientists, as composers, like, universal language of music. People have forgotten that Beethoven was a German. He has now become a Chinese or South African or Congolese or Venezuelan. So in that sense, I think the future will have less emphasis on the contradiction of nations, but emphasize more and more that which unites us. And the language of science and the language of culture will be the future common language of mankind. So I think we will also see that as a process of evolution. However, right now there is no alternative to the idea of national sovereignty, because that is the absolute necessary bastion against the oligarchy and international colonial and imperial structures. So I hope I have answered that question.
Thank you very much, Helga, for such an answer. We are now going to ask a series of questions that we have received from our international friends, people who are participating in this webcast at international level. We have a question for Helga, which we got from Greece. And I'm going to combine it with a question that we got from Spain. Both countries are in the sights of the IMF and the Troika. In Greece, Professor Nicolas Present, who is a well-known journalist as well, is asking the following question.
En Grecia,
In Greece,
el gobierno alienta la expectativa
the government cultivates the expectation that President Obama
una política alternativa
has an alternative, better policy than that of Chancellor Merkel and the Eurozone,
o por lo menos
or at least that
próxima reunión
in the coming meeting of Greek Prime Minister Samaras with Obama,
este último
the latter will offer the perspective of major United States investments and the purchase of the Greek debt by the United States on the beneficial terms.
en condiciones favorables. ¿Cuáles son
What are your comments on this?
La segunda pregunta,
The second question,
pero relacionada,
which I believe is connected,
viene de
comes from Spain,
Mitoa Eyan Campos,
from Mitoa Eyan Campos,
radio de
who is a journalist. He works for radio in Madrid.
problema de salir de
And his question is, what would be the problem of leaving the euro if Spain or some other country will abandon that common currency?
Gracias por
What will his position be vis-a-vis the European market?
esas son las dos preguntas.
Will the economy survive acting by itself? Thank you for the work you're carrying out.
Well, I think, unfortunately, I'm not optimistic about the promises of Obama because I think, first of all, look at what he is doing in terms of economic policy to the United States itself, which is being turned right now into a new third world country. Pockets like Detroit or the South, they don't speak for his well-intention. And the problem with Obama and Merkel is that they're basically belonging to the same category, that they are not their own masters. I think Obama is not his own master, and I think Merkel is unfortunately not her own master, but both are carrying out the policies of the British Empire or the global Anglo-American, Anglo-Dutch Empire, which is detriment to the interest of their own nation. So I would not bet my luck on these promises, because unless you have a complete change of the system, I mean, I think, if you stay within the IMF and the present globalization system, you will have a blowout of the system anywhere between a hyperinflation like 1923 in Germany in the entire transatlantic zone, and you will have the bail-in I tried to describe earlier, which is the most brutal cut Cyprus template, Detroit template, which none of the European nations would survive. And since Obama is making maximum pressure on the Europeans to go in the direction of banking union, more Europe, I mean, nothing, not one iota of hope can be combined with that. Now, I think no European country will survive this present crisis if we remain in this system. Now, it is very easy to get out of this because people say, well, but what difficulties will we have if we leave the euro? Well, this is nothing compared to the difficulty which everyone, including Germany, including Greece and Spain, will have if we remain in the euro. The euro is a complete failed experiment. It was supposed to be that from the beginning. It was never meant to succeed. It was from the beginning part of the effort to subdue Europe under the imperial structure of the globalization, and it was just a regional expression of this global empire. Now, we have developed a package of measures which really would remedy the situation. Now, first of all, we need Glass-Steagall. Hopefully the United States will go for the implementation quickly. Then in every European nation we need Glass-Steagall legislations on a national basis. Then we need to have the immediate exit from the euro, which according to all international law is very easy, because every country can leave an international treaty if it violates its fundamental national interest. Then, however, we need to have the sovereign control over the own currency, and national economic policy, we have to go for fixed exchange rates after we have implemented the new lira, the new Deutschmark, the new peso, or whatever currency, drachme. Then we have to have a credit system which is basically not only generating national credit for real production, but we need a long-term multilateral agreement among the sovereign countries of Europe and other nations of the world for long-term investments. Now, the only way how Greece and Spain can come out of this crisis is by building up the productive power of your own labor force. You have to repatriate the many skilled people who left Spain, Portugal, Greece, and you have to create an incentive that they return. Now, we have developed a development program for Southern Europe which has many components and which you can see at our webpage. It's basically starting with the infrastructure corridors, which already were agreed upon by the EU transport ministers in 1994. 10 corridors into the Balkans, into Greece, into Spain, into Italy, then bridges and tunnels connecting Gibraltar with Morocco, Sicily with Tunisia, and then having the expansion of this infrastructure development corridors along the Mediterranean into the Middle East, into Africa, and then combine that with certain science driver programs like space centers in the Canary Islands, a science center in the city of Essence, and other projects like water management, irrigation, developing the internal parts of Spain, which right now is poorly developed and poorly populated. And in that way, you create a Marshall Plan for Southern Europe, which may cause a couple of hardships in the beginning, but it would give you a perspective of turning Greece once again into a transport hub between Asia, between Europe, and to turn Spain into a transport and connection between Europe and Africa. And that way you develop a future. If you don't have these kinds of developments and based on high energy flux densities, then you have a perspective of repatriating young people, of having a serious development plan. Now, essentially, you need to do the same thing what FDR did with the New Deal in America, what Germany did after 45 with the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which was modeled, basically on this situation in the United States. And then you can have something like the German economic miracle after 45. Now, if there are multilateral agreements among the nations of Europe and Eurasia, there is no reason why this whole region right now, which is torn by horror, by refugees, by war, by insecurity, why that region cannot be turned into a very prosperous part of the world. And I think if we combine that with a revival of the classical tradition of ancient Greece, of the great ideas of the pre-Socratic thinkers, of Homer, of Socrates, of Plato, of the great tragedians, of the idea that Greece once was the cradle of European civilization. The same goes for Italy, the Italian Renaissance, for Spain, the Andalusian Renaissance, which helped to bring Europe out of the Dark Ages. Now we have to rekindle these ideas, and then I think that the future of Europe will be absolutely great. But it has to be a complete change of the paradigm, and there is no solution possible within the present one.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias, Helga.
Thank you very much, Helga.
de las alternativas económicas
We have been talking about the economic alternatives
en varias preguntas que
that
hemos
we are
escuchado.
asked. We're getting a lot of questions in that regard.
Son dos preguntas
Two questions
dirigidas a mí.
that
Una de
were
Grecia,
came to one for me, one from Greece.
pregunta de Grecia,
The question from Greece,
el profesor de economía,
it comes from an economic professor
profesor de la Universidad de Pireus,
from the University of Piraeus
fundador del nuevo partido,
and the founder of the new anti-Euro Drachma 5 party. And he says the following: I would like to know the future plans of the Argentinian government.
está enfrentando los problemas
How is it facing the problems that have been created by the vulture funds and by the banks in general? Does it have the support of the Argentinian people specifically? What does it think of the Glass-Steagall? And what is the general condition of the Argentinian economy?
nos interesa
I would like to know if the government of Kirchner has any recommendation for us regarding the so-called Grexit
o salida
or the Greece exit from the euro.
a Grecia.
A visit to Greece or on the part of some Argentinian official of high level to explain the Kirchner policy would be very welcome here.
Y la siguiente pregunta
The next question,
de Brasil,
which comes to us from Brazil,
de Alfredo Anjus.
which comes to us from Alfredo Anjus in Brazil,
Brasil depende del flujo
says Brazil depends on the influx of dollars
para mantener.
and the carry trade to keep functioning.
Recientemente,
Recently, the government increased the interest rates to 5% a year to satisfy the international banks.
a los bancos internacionales
The pretext was that there was too much inflation.
de la inflación. ¿Cómo
How can Brazil continue functioning
funcionando
if there is a break with the international creditors
internacionales y la
and the dollar inflow is interrupted?
el
The
país
country could go bankrupt immediately.
qué hace?
What should be done?
Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you for your answer
Y salud.
and greetings from Brazil.
Ahora, sobre la pregunta del profesor Cataneva,
Regarding the question from Professor Castanedas,
el gobierno argentino,
regarding the Argentina government,
decir, poner en boca de ellos lo que ellos dicen. Sin embargo,
I don't want to put words in their mouth. However,
en base a lo que han dicho respecto a su propio,
regarding what they have said, their own country, their own policy,
es la orientación del gobierno argentino.
that is the policy of the Argentinian government.
No solamente la presidenta Kirchner
Not only President Kirchner
ha dicho que le parece impensable
has said that she believes it's unthinkable
está produciendo dentro de Europa en este momento.
to do what is going on in Europe right now.
Acordarnos,
We also must remember
había dicho
that she has said
el presidente Néstor Kirchner
what her husband has said, the late Nestor Kirchner.
en Múnich, Alemania.
He said that in Munich, Germany,
Hay vida después del
that there is life after the IMF,
una vida.
and there's a very good life.
Ahora, eso en el 2005,
He said that in 2005.
1995,
Now we go back to 1995,
R de Lyndon LaRouche,
when Lyndon LaRouche
un informe especial
in EIR published a special report
con el título
which was titled, There is Life After the IMF.
Internacional. Entonces creo que
I believe then
es bastante evidente que
that is evident
el camino para Europa es el
that the road for Europe
camino que Helga ha
is the road that Helga has laid out.
establecido por completo.
You have to
Tiene que no solamente
break completely with the IMF,
salir del euro,
not only leave the euro,
se tiene que salir de Europa,
but you have the Europe has to be gotten rid of in all of Europe,
de saqueo y
because it's only an instrument for looting and for destruction.
las medidas
And the measures
Glass-Steagall para componer la situación
that Glass-Steagall brings forward to solve the situation that have been brought forward.
como el movimiento de LaRouche nos parece
We in the LaRouche movement believe that that is what needs to be done.
entre los patriotas argentinos
And there has to be a dealing between the Argentine patriots and the Greek patriots,
estadounidenses y los rusos
and the American patriots and the Russian patriots and the Chinese patriots
nacional, porque solamente
to fight the IMF,
nación internacional
because only through an international alliance
patriotas de nuestros
of patriots of the different nations,
ciudadanos del mundo, Alex,
the national sovereign states,
podremos derrotar al imperio
will we be able to defeat the British Empire.
breve que tengo que
And that is the brief answer to what you have asked.
funcionar Brasil sin
And then the question of whether Brazil can function without the carry trade.
bancarrota inmediata.
and that would lead to Brazil to immediate bankruptcy. Brazil is in bankruptcy. That is not going to be caused because we stop the carry trade. The only thing that happens when it opens this country to the financial vultures is that the money leaves the country. But before the carry trade, but what more important than the money that's coming in is the real wealth that is leaving the country. That applies to Brazil, it applies to Argentina, and it applies to the United States as well. We must knock the board over completely and change the situation from a monetary system to a system that give money value to, for example, drugs, and then change that system with a Hamiltonian system, which you issue credit for productive activity. The carry trade must be ended because it is a parasite. It's a cancer. And you cannot negotiate with a cancer. You destroy it, and then you cure the body. And that's the way to do that, is with a Hamiltonian credit system. And no, we have a question for Helga, which came from two organizers from the International LaRouche movement, Aguilera, and they asked the following question. As we know, and we have found out, the situation has been deteriorating, and we can see that in different strata that are interested in learning these things. In terms of following the prescriptions, they leave aside the real development, the real potential. This has made people unable to understand that they evade their responsibility to go for a solution along the lines of Glass-Steagall. My question is the following. What do we have to do to change the way in which we educate the people so that we can develop as real human beings and make humanity progress? Helga?
Well, I think that I think people should pay a lot of attention to their own mind, their creativity, to their soul. They should make sure they develop a beautiful soul, because you see, the problem right now we have is that, you know, my husband Lynn LaRouche has been saying recently a lot that only 5% of the population of most nations are even thinking. Now, that may be too optimistic in some places, because the problem is most people are so completely downtrodden, you know, they're almost two-dimensional. They think what they have experienced, my experience, I know this, you know, I have this knowledge, you know, and it comes from my experience. Now, most people read the newspaper and say, oh, I saw this in the newspaper, so it must be true. All of these things are wrong, because an intelligent person would say, oh, wait a second, you know, my experience says this, but now we are in a revolutionary change, so maybe I have to discount my experience because everything is being completely redefined new. Or people would say, oh, I read this in the newspaper, why is it written? What is the purpose of the author? Who owns the newspaper? What campaign they are running to stupefy the population? So, you know, if people are not having that kind of a self-consciousness, they are missing completely the boat. And since the oligarchy has been trying a long time, you know, since empires exist, in the Roman Empire it was bread and circus. People were consciously made stupid so that they would not challenge the powers to be. That method of the Roman Empire has been made much more much more sophisticated, because, you know, the whole entertainment and the whole way of making people stupid has become more perverse, more bestial, more perverse in all respects, more violent. So the people who accept this present culture, you know, they have been pretty much destroyed. So if you want to save the 5% of the people, and that is not a cause for pessimism, because history has never been made by the masses, but it was always outstanding creative individuals who would come up with flanks, with new ways of thinking, with new solutions, who have changed the course of history. So therefore, in a certain sense, if you apply that knowledge, the most important is that you become as creative as possible. And by that, I don't mean, you know, just some funny pottery or some what a greenie would describe as creative, but I mean to really access in your mind that faculty which, for example, a great musical classical composer was applying. And you can study that by studying the classical composition, by studying the great dramas of Shakespeare, of Schiller, of Cervantes, or studying the great classical poetry to understand what is the faculty of mind which enables you to be practically inner-directed, to be self-conscious, to be aware of your social situation, to come up with the flank, with the irony, to be completely emotionally and as well as intellectually intelligent. So, because only if you have developed that capability that you can really reach into the hearts of the other people. And it is my experience, in this case, positive one, that only if you can initiate the spark of creativity in the other human being and you give them a taste of their own humanity, how they could become and what they could participate in a transformed human civilization, that you can really move people. So I think it will take a miracle to save civilization at this point, because it's very, very far gone. Civilization hangs by a thread. But then, you know, I never, ever lost in my life this basic optimism that the laws of the universe are too beautiful that the Creator could have made them in vain. And, you know, I think that, you know, I don't think that the creation has been made by the Creator with all the beautiful laws of the universe so that it would all have meant nothing. Now, that instills me with the same kind of deep optimism, like, for example, Johannes Kepler, who in a writing which was always almost a prayer or a poem, and he said, the more I study the laws of the universe, the more I recognize that there must be a loving Creator, and that gives me confidence. And that happens to be the same idea like what Schiller wrote in the famous Ode to Joy, which was then composed by Beethoven to be the Ninth Symphony, where, you know, there is this beautiful passage which says, above the stars there must be a loving Father. And the more we know about modern astronomy, and the more we know secrets which neither Schiller nor Beethoven nor Kepler could know, the more it becomes true, because the more you study the secrets of the universe, the more you recognize what a tremendous plan of creation exists. Now, that means there is the possibility, it doesn't mean a guarantee. I think the guarantee comes from us. I think it was also Friedrich Schiller who said that he believes in miracles, but only in the miracles we do through our own arm. So, you know, this creates a tremendous tension between potential and chance and danger. But if we take this chance, if we, you know, do what we know we are capable of as being in the image of the Creator, I think we will be stronger than Satan.
Bueno, muchas gracias.
Well, thank you very much.
Nos han llegado muchísimas
We
preguntas
have received
relacionadas
many questions
desde Filipinas,
from Philippines,
Colombia
from
y
Colombia,
otros países.
and from other
A estas
countries.
alturas tenemos tiempo para
At this point,
dos preguntas.
we have time for two questions.
Quiero pasar primero a
First,
Argentina para ver si
I want to go to Argentina to see if they have any questions there pending from the audience. Yes, there is a question. Hello. I would like to ask if Glass-Steagall was adopted and by a culture and a society that is still based on capitalism and private enterprise. Is it possible that knowing that the theory, but if you apply such a that policy, is it possible within that kind of a system?
Helga, ¿te gustaría responder a esa
Helga, would you like to answer that question?
Yes. Well, I think most people have not yet thought through under what circumstances this would occur. Because first of all, I think people have not really thought through how close we are to the complete disintegration of the financial system, be it through hyperinflation or through it be the supernova disintegration or the kind of mass genocide implemented through the bail-in policy. We are sitting on the top of a volcano which is about to blow out. And I tell you, this is not just our opinion, but ever since Mr. LaRouche has made this analysis, we have discussed this with a lot of people in high banking positions, people who agree with us. I mean, there are decent bankers who absolutely do not want to be part of this excessive profit making at the expense of the millions of lives of people. But there are decent bankers who want to go back to industrial banking, who want to go back to the kind of banking which existed in the time of Hermann Abs or Alfred Herrhausen. These were German bankers who believed that the banking should be in the service of industry. Now, in the United States, there is a whole bunch of such bankers. For example, the present vice president of the FDIC, Thomas Hoenig, is such a banker. There are many regional bankers of savings and loans banks who immediately agree with that. So we are not talking to a complete hostile banking community, but to a banking community which is highly divided. However, these are also people, and we have been discussing with them, who absolutely 100% agree that if either the blowout occurs or the bail-in occurs, that people have no idea what would happen. You would have an immediate disappearance of food, energy, the supermarkets would empty in a few hours, electricity would collapse, you would have no more use of telephone, mobile phones, all of this would disintegrate, and you would have mass death suddenly. Now, I tell you, there are top bankers and top government officials who have told us that they think what the present policies are is completely irresponsible because it plays with the life of millions, if not hundreds of millions of people. Now, most people don't think that through, so therefore they say, there is no alternative, we could just go on. We cannot go on. There is no way how the system will continue. Now, therefore, when this question comes, either total chaos or Glass-Steagall, hopefully, Glass-Steagall will be implemented before the chaos erupts, then that will occur only, under conditions of a real complete change. For example, if the investment banks are bankrupted because they have no longer access to the assets of the commercial banks and no more bailouts from the taxpayer, well, then you will have an immediate liquidity shortage, and there is no other way than to go for a credit system. And basically we have to then have ready-made development plans like NAVAPA for North America, like the different plans like the Plino project for Mexico, and the whole question of the Latin American infrastructure integration, the South European Marshall Plan, the plan for the Mediterranean, the infrastructure plan for Africa, for the Middle East. These things have to be put into motion right away. And that can only happen by basically, using the moment of shock. So therefore the best thing we can do is spread the word as much as possible. Involve scientists who understand the principles of physics, of physical economy, who understand the principle of physical scientific discovery. And then we have to simply move, to change the paradigm in all respects. Now, I don't believe this kind of transition will occur without a tremendous shock effect, like a Pearl Harbor effect, where people all of a sudden, are confronted with the fact that everything they have believed in to the present moment is invalid, and that they have to go back to valid concepts which did work in the past, like in the reconstruction of Germany after 1945, or the New Deal of Roosevelt, or the Meiji Restoration in Japan, or the planification policies of Charles de Gaulle, and simply apply them to modern times. So I think we will go into a shock period one way or another. I think we will need nerves of steel, because this will not be easy. But the best thing governments and institutions, trade unions, chambers of commerce, and other institutional forces can do to study the kinds of programs which we have been working out for the last 40 decades. If you go on the different websites, the Schiller Institute New Paradigm website, or the LaRouche PEC website, or the Spanish website, you find that we have worked out detailed plans for the reconstruction of the world economy, the world land bridge, the Eurasian land bridge, large water projects, NAVAPA, Transaqua for Africa, to refill the Central Asian lake through rivers from the Aral Lake, through rivers from Siberia. So we have developed all these different projects which can be implemented, and the best thing is that we can start to organize a world movement for solutions. Right now you have almost everywhere global resistance, uprising, demonstrations, people are protesting the NSA spying, they are going on the streets in Turkey, in Egypt, in many countries. You have a sense that this present old structure is collapsing. But what is needed is a mass movement for solutions. And there I can assure you, the only universal comprehensive solution how the world can get out of the mess is by implementing Glass-Steagall credit system and projects detailed in the World Land Bridge. And that is what we have to get mass movements for. So I think that, this will not go without big eruptions, big tremors, but I think it's also a period in which populations can make sudden changes in their view, like it occurred after Pearl Harbor. So let's be prepared and mobilize like we have never mobilized in our life, because what is at stake is our life, that of our prosperity, and that of the existence of civilization at large.
Well, thank you very much. We have time for one last question, which I believe has been answered to in part. But with that question, the combination of those two last questions, it takes us to the subject. We got this question from Mexico. We talk about in terms of CONAGUA, which is the national authority in charge of water. And what are the main points of agreement between the policy of the Argentinian government with the program of Mr. LaRouche? And the second question that we're getting has to do with part of what is talked raised by the first question, given the strategic battle we have to reestablish Glass-Steagall, which has been led by your husband, Lyndon LaRouche. What is the role that the nations of Europe and Latin America must play in this battle, and what is the opinion of your good friend, Nicolas of Cusa? Helga?
Well, I think, I mean, the simple level is that we have to have a mass movement for Glass-Steagall because of the revolving door policy between the banking system and the parliaments. We cannot just rely on the parliaments, but we have to create the pressure from the base, from the trade unions, from the mayors, from the city councils, from the social workers, from simply the base of people demanding that the parliamentarians introduce very quickly Glass-Steagall laws. Now that is possible. We have, for example, in Italy, as I mentioned, already 5 bills for Glass-Steagall. Practically every single party has introduced their own Glass-Steagall law, and the good thing is they all think it's their idea. Now, naturally it's not, but it doesn't matter. But when people start to think an idea is their own, then they naturally start to fight for it more passionately. We are trying right now to get these Italian parties to unify their effort, nevertheless, to make it one single Glass-Steagall bill and have a national unity to implement it. In France, for example, where we had the unfortunate complete disaster of a fake banking law, nevertheless we have I think presently more than 250 mayors who have come out to endorse Glass-Steagall. 40 of them have now put it in front of their councils so that they should also adopt Glass-Steagall to again make pressure from the base on the National Assembly to go for Glass-Steagall. Now I think mayors and city councils and these kinds of people are much more close to the problems of their constituents, their villages, their local budgets, their municipal problems, and therefore they normally understand much better why you need this change. So I think the best thing people in Latin America and in Europe can do is to create this kind of pressure from the local governments, the local mayors, upward to the national parliaments, so that basically people are prepared for Glass-Steagall, that they study what it is, what it was historically, what Roosevelt did, what is happening in the United States, feed the battle we are waging in the United States in real time into each country in Latin America and in Europe. Because the media normally do not report. We have a gigantic battle. We have turned Washington upside down, and not only Washington, but many state capitals where we have a gigantic mobilization, and the chance is quite realistic that this will be adopted. Now, if the United States goes for Glass-Steagall, this will mean an instant change. And if we then have many national parliaments in Latin America and in Europe who already are prepared in the form that they have an existing bill, then that can be led to the immediate implementation of similar legislation in each country. So on that level, it's fairly simple. It just means a lot of work. We need to have to talk and educate to a lot of elected officials. But that can be done, under conditions of this present very pregnant revolutionary moment in world history relatively easy. Now that part is easy, and I think if I would ask my friend Nikolaus of Kues what advice he would give, I think he would say, go for the new paradigm in thinking. Because, when he was writing his great works, the Docta Ignorantia and others, he was completely aware that he was thinking something which no human being had ever been thinking before. As a matter of fact, he said so. He said, I'm writing and thinking now something which has never been thought by anybody, and I know that it will create a completely new era of thinking. And, if you look at the method of thinking, what he developed, it is true, he developed this idea of the coincidentia oppositorum, that you can think on the level of reason, that you can think above all the conflicts, that you can find the one which has a higher quality than the many. Recently, my husband has emphasized the role of the chorus in the play of Shakespeare, Henry V. Schiller has written a lot similar things like about the role of chorus in the prelogue of the Bridge of Messina, and he has also applied that method in the prologue of the great trilogy Wallenstein. He has applied it not only in the prologue but also in the Wallenstein camp. How do you address that level of thinking on a higher level, of not being just self-evident with what you seem to feel and think, but how can you look into the future? How can you have a vision what the future must be, and then judge what is going on and should be going on in the present from that vantage point? And when he developed that method of thinking, Nikolaus of Kues, he consciously broke with the entire body of knowledge of his time. Because if you remember, he lived from 1401 to 1464, which was just, the beginning of the 15th century, leaving behind the dark age of the 14th century, and the entire university life at that time was completely dominated by scholasticism, a kind of mysticism and superstition. The Peripatetics, the Neo-Aristotelians, who could not elevate their level of thinking to this kind of thinking from above. So he consciously polemicized that and attacked it. He said, these people who think on that low level, they don't understand anything, and you have to elevate yourself to the level of thinking from the above, from the coincidentia oppositorum. And since that is not so easy, he wrote, for example, in the beautiful writing about the vision of God, he developed a metaphor how you can actually throw your thinking sort of behind the wall of the coincidence of the fall into one of the opposites. And it is worth to study these works, because these are pedagogical writings of how you can train your mind not to fall in the trap of empiricism or a positivism or whatever people nowadays are thinking but to actually think in terms of a creative human being. Now, what would be the new paradigm for the future today, in the same way like Cusanus broke with the paradigm of the Middle Ages and introduced the axiomatic thinking for the modern times? Well, I think it would mean, going away from the idea that war can be a way of conflict resolution in the time of thermonuclear weapons, to go away from the idea of greed, of all the attributes which go along with globalization and monetarism, and really go into a new era of civilization, of adulthood of mankind, where people, start to treasure what is most valuable about themselves, their mind and their soul. Become scientists, become artists, become great teachers, become loving parents, become, the kinds of people who reach to the stars and, make sure that civilization will go on for many millenniums to come, which may be a mind-boggling idea for most people. But if we want to become the immortal species, the one species which is not going to go extinct in the great extinctions which periodically happen, but we prove that we can, through our creative mentation, conquer every problem and become more human. Because only if we become more aesthetically educated, if we become more loving, if we become more, beautiful human beings from the standpoint of creative mind and beautiful soul, then only then it's worth the effort. So, I think we can do it. And if we have a good plan, and as Schiller said many times, if many good people come together for a good plan, then the worst tyranny and the worst power of the tyrant can be broken, and we can create a good future. So I think that's what we should do.
Well, with those words, we will conclude this webcast about Glass-Steagall. We're going to have one, we want to thank the audience in Argentina, the people who have been listening to us through internet in Mexico, and above all, I want to thank Helga Zepp-LaRouche for having participated with us, join us in this discussion. Good evening to all of you.